Okay, well, I'm just really delighted to have Daniel and Richie here as part of this panel, and we would have loved to have had the younger Daniel as well, but there'll be another time for him. And I just want to start by asking you, Richie, and particularly for those that didn't get to hear you last night, your name obviously isn't a porn star name, as some of us had thought, Richie Hardcore. It would have been a great porn star name, but I'm glad you were.
I probably have a lot more money.
Do you want to just explain what your name means and why you adopted that name, and tell us some of the work that you've been doing around dismantling, deconstructing unhealthy ideas about masculinity in the last few years?
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone, thanks for coming today, and thanks for having me on your panel. I really appreciate it. Yeah, hardcore is my ring name. I used to be a professional kickboxer. And hardcore is also a style of music that I grew up in the culture of. And I used to do a radio show called Viva la Hardcore, and have been involved heavily in the music scene and the Muay Thai kickboxing scene for a long time. And I ended up changing my name legally when I was 26 because I thought it would be funny, and I never thought I'd be an educator around pornography. And it's still funny.
It's still funny, yes.
But the counterculture which I grew up on is very formative for me, and the music that I've grown up listening to introduced me to concepts around feminism and gender equity and animal rights and challenging capitalism, and that's what I decided to pursue when I went to university in my mid-20s. And the songs, the bands that I listened to often looked at things like sexism, and that made me reflect on my own behaviour. I went to an all-boys high school, and very much was part of, I guess, the culture which I now, I guess, deconstruct. You know, like I grew up with pornography and consuming pornography and gym locker room talk and banter and all that, but the more that I got educated explicitly around those things, the more it made sense to me that it doesn't work for men or for women, and if we want to end violence, then we need to start with ourselves. And I guess I was sensitive to that because I grew up with a degree of violence in my household. My father is an alcoholic and in recovery, and I love my dad, and he's made a whole lot of changes. But childhood was difficult, and that was very formative for me. And so fast forward to now, I work with a whole range of different organisations in New Zealand. I work with our government's Ministry of Social Development. I do a lot of contract speaking for them, and I'm just developing actually a workshop that I was talking about last night, where we get MMA coaches and Muay Thai coaches and kickboxing coaches to run workshops for other kickboxers and fighters. But at the same time, we've got 3 speakers, myself, a gentleman called Peter Thorburn, a guy called Matteo Brown, who are mental health workers and anti-family violence workers, to also impart some knowledge and some countercultural ideas around masculinity and being vulnerable and talking about things that they potentially might not talk about. But those things affect us massively. New Zealand's the worst country in the world for reportable rates of family violence, called to the police every 4 minutes. You know, some around sexual violence are similar. So we're trying to take the mountain to Muhammad, as it were, because the sort of guys who go to a kickboxing gym aren't necessarily going to be the sort of guys who are going to come to this conference, are they? So it's about trying to reach them on a level that they understand and embed some ideas that not only appeal to their own self-interest, but to their broader sense of what's good. Because I've come to understand now that I work with guys who have been offenders, that offenders are made just as much victims in a way as the people who experience the crimes that they perpetrate. You know, like if we're teaching boys from a very young age that you have to be tough and stoic, and girls are less than, and as Melinda's powerfully painted, you know, we indoctrinate young men with these ideas before they have any sort of critical filters. I think the violence that they perpetrate is a logical outcome of that. And a lot of offenders witness violence in their own childhood, and they're just recreating what's modelled to them. So we need to do a better job as society to bring men who have been violent back into the fold. And I work alongside men in New Zealand who have been offenders, and they're now really, really powerful anti-violence advocates. You know, they've used their own experiences as powerful tools to bring men into the conversation. And at the same time, we need to do a better job of teaching boys from a very young age that they don't need to fit into all those stereotypical ideas about what it means to be a man. Part of which is having power and dominance over women and being sexually aggressive and being a stud and all of that. So for the government, I worked for White Ribbon New Zealand, and I worked for myself.
Was there a moment when you recognised that porn was deforming you and deforming your sexuality? Was there a particular kind of light bulb moment, or was it sort of an evolution of this recognition of harm?
Perhaps deforming is a strong word.
You don't think you're deformed?
I don't think I'm deformed, no. But porn definitely shaped my sexuality. You know, I first saw pornography when I was 10 years old, and then went to an intermediate school and an all-boys high school, and it's just part and parcel of, I guess, growing up, until I started thinking about it more critically. But actually there's a really bad rap metal song called Ritual by a band from Los Angeles called Downset, and it made me think very explicitly about, I never considered these ideas. And it talks about like 1 out of 3, and they say my sisters are free, incarcerated by misogyny and all this sort of stuff. And I started reflecting on what I'd been consuming, and started, we were talking about it last night, I started Googling feminism, started Googling pornography. Perhaps Google wasn't a search engine at the start of the 2000s, I can't remember. And I started reading work of Robert Jensen and whatnot, and made me start thinking about my own sex life and how I had sex, and it was very really about like making love, and it was more about like being hot and being performative and athletic, and I had to have sex for an hour, which is very hard to do.
Even as a porn star.
Even as a porn star,
Yeah.
You need a lot of Viagra. And yeah, I had to unpack that. I had to understand that sex was more than about not just on the bedpost, and about connecting with someone emotionally as much as physically. And I think that's a shame that a lot of young men don't get to understand that till they're much older in life.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And I think in this day and age of like hookup apps and Tinder and Grindr and Bumble and stuff like that, sex has become very, very transactional and part and parcel of a society where we're always looking for coping mechanisms, to numb out our poor mental health or numb our affect, and we're using people in the way that we've used alcohol or drugs or other things. And the pornification of culture is part and parcel of that, I think, as well.
Yep. Daniel, I've known you for about 5 or 6 years, and do you want to tell people here today what was the formative influence for you to get involved in addressing porn culture, speaking out against porn, deconstructing masculinity or reimagining a new way of being male? What were the early influences on you that led you to this point?
Sure. Should I grab this one?
Sure.
Firstly, just want to thank the organisers of this event for having me here, and obviously Melinda for the opportunity to come and speak. For me, I'll probably borrow from a bit of my talk, so if I repeat myself a bit later, please forgive me. But yeah, I think for me, it was growing up, and sexual assault and sexual violence and domestic violence was just never far away. I think you encounter that within your families, within people you care for, friends at school. And so for me, I'd love to say, I woke up, reading radical feminism, and I had Melinda and Renata's books in my hand from a young age, but that wasn't the case. It really was just seeing the hurts and the harms that other people have endured, and just eventually going, this just isn't right. And there was no outlet for that, because I went to a Catholic all-boys school. I was really bullied on, which I'll touch on later, and there is no outlet. You just kind of go, this is just the way things are, and you feel helpless and powerless. And so I'm so grateful that I discovered Melinda's work. I started to question porn culture probably in my early 20s, and just at that point, I just thought, I'm so mad that this horrific, debasing, anti-sex, anti-love messaging and propaganda has influenced my mind for what at that point would have been 10 years off and on. I would never say I was addicted, but it was something that I was exposed to probably about 10 or 11. And I think I just hit that point where I was just like, I hate that this has occupied part of my mind. I have to do something, not only for me personally, but just men and women. And then the sad thing for me is, like, I've had married men call me ever since I started work in this area and publicly started being quite vocal about the harms of pornography. Yeah, you get pushback from idiots, but you know, whatever. But having married women in their 40s calling me, calling me to say, I've just discovered that my husband's been looking at porn for 15 years. And that for me is just like, I can't fathom that person's grief of that, of just feeling like, you know, something so sacred has been such a lie and not the good that it could have been. So yeah, for me, I think I'm just so driven by the fact that things that are good and beautiful have been so robbed.
Well said. This is a pretty direct question. It's a mystery to me that I don't understand. Why would a man want to choke a woman? Do you have any insights into that?
Yeah, I think, so scientifically speaking, when you start getting your sexual arousal pathways wired synaptically, like your neurological pathways, through pornography from a very young age, and if the research tells us that the average age of first exposure is 10 or 11 years old, depending on what you read, you can get aggression wired into your sexual response pathway. Does that make sense? So I've quite often spoken at schools, and parents have told me that their 17-year-old son has got erectile dysfunction, and having been a 17-year-old boy, like, that's not the time that you normally have erectile dysfunction. You know, some of you guys are sniggering like, yep, there's a lot of cold showers when I was 17. And that's because the real life sexual interactions that they're having with regular girls aren't arousing them the way that hardcore, aggressive, choking, slapping, gangbangs, all that sort of stuff in pornography has shaped the way that their brain works. You know, like it's a physiological problem now, and it doesn't mean that it can't change because we have neuroplasticity, so our brains can be reshaped, but it's a very difficult process, and it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of alternative exposures, right? So from a very young age, a lot of kids are getting sex mixed up with aggression or connected, you know, like we're very much sexualized violence against women in a very physiological way, and so young men find that arousing, and young women are increasingly using pornography to come to understand what to expect of sex. You know, so there's this two-way negative highway of what sex is shaped by porn, as opposed to this just fun, kind, authentic, natural discovery of what you actually like. I think a lot of people follow the pornographic script without having had the chance to discover what their own sexuality is. Yeah. And I would say that's true of me, and I guess that's a derivative of grief, you know, like, you know, like, so it's just, that's why I think like the technological side of this conversation is important too. Like, how do you get age verification? How do you make sure 11-year-olds aren't just coming across like a gangbang website when they're, you know, on the phone looking for cupcakes or whatever, you know? Now, you can search the most innocuous terms, the most, you know, harmless terms and come up with porn because it's so ubiquitous. So how do we protect kids from encountering that? Because it is designed to arouse you on some level, right? And so when things arouse us and we think about our dopamine pathways and our reward and pleasure pathways, that's how kids start getting hooked into it. And then when you grow up with violence is what's arousing you and giving you neurological chemicals popping off, that's where you start enacting in your real life, sex life.
Okay. You both, I think, would have seen the Gillette ad. And I just wonder why there was such a backlash. For example, critics of that ad, which I wrote about favourably, I wrote about the ad favourably. I felt that it was calling men to something higher and something better. Critics said things like, this ad represents the destruction of manhood as we know it. It's dark and disturbing. Any men who supported that ad or spoke favourably about it was called a soy boy. for those of you not vegans, that's not a great thing. It's not a good thing to be called a soy boy. Why did we see such a backlash? Like, this was massive. It was like this global meltdown, and the MRAs already nuts went even more nuts than they usually are.
Yeah.
That's men's rights activists, for those of you who don't move in those kind of circles. Why do you think that was?
Sorry, I'm smiling. I just find all of this just so hilarious.
Yeah, I don't think it's working.
I think it's the patheticness of it that I find so hilarious and sad. Because these are the same men who call other people soy boys, tell people that they're sooks, that they get so upset, like, don't be so offended, toughen up. And here they are, shrieking like banshees, because heaven forbid someone's encouraged them to be the best that they could actually be. I mean, the irony of that, I hope that's not lost on anyone, that these are the same men who think we should toughen up, not be so offended as a society, are the most offended group of absolute soy boys I've ever seen. And so, yeah, I just find that just laughable. Sorry, I'm just a bit animated. So
we don't mind.
The hope in it is I actually ran a men's group, and, you know, I kind of didn't ask their consent for whether we were going to watch the Gillette ad that night. They were watching the Gillette ad, whether they liked it or not. And other than one guy in the room, every single one of them said he resonated with the message. So just to hear that we live in a culture of outrage and the loudest voices are heard, and that's sometimes a good thing or a bad thing, but I actually don't think it was picked up that badly by a lot of men that I've encountered. No doubt that there was a pushback, and I'll touch on that. But I think, yeah, a lot of the average guy was like, yeah, that's really, really reasonable. The interesting thing was, though, is that someone said something along the lines of, what was it? Oh, this is just, you know, it's just those feminists. And I'm just sitting here at this men's group. There's the one guy that piped up, and he's like, oh, it's just those feminists, you know, trying to indoctrinate us. And I said, oh, really? Like, can you point them out to me? Like, who are these really powerful feminists that are, you know, trying to indoctrinate us? And, you know, for him, it was this conspiracy theory, you know. And I said, well, what happens if it was actually men creating that message? Would it be okay then? And then he stopped and was like, oh, yeah, well, I guess that'd be all right then.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it was almost that there was these, you know, feminists hiding in the corner with these, you know, secret agendas to indoctrinate men, you know, heaven forbid. So I found that kind of interesting, and there is definitely a pushback, and there is definitely, and I've encountered it, you know, in different friendships groups where they see this, you know, vision of masculinity under threat that they're trying to hold on to, and they can't hear it. And to kind of echo what Richie said last night about trying to find a language, because this is the thing that does my head in. It's like when we use the word toxic masculinity, we're not saying masculinity is toxic. It's like if someone says that water is toxic, that doesn't mean water is bad, but that water is actually poison, don't drink it, you know. So it's describing the particular water, not water, period. And so for me, it's like, how do we actually engage and use a language and a framework where they'll be able to go, there are some things about masculinity that are not healthy, that need to be done away with and need to just be left behind. And so it's trying to take these men on that journey, and hopefully that is something that we can discuss and brainstorm today, because yeah, those are the ones that just get their backs up and dig in even harder. But be encouraged, there was a lot more people that I think resonated with it, and a lot more men that I saw come out publicly and say that was a fantastic message and more of it.
Great. You mentioned needing to take men along on the journey. How do we do that? Because often what happens in our experience is we get a men, there's usually one in every audience, who say, what are you doing for men?
Yeah.
And we say, what are you doing for men? Like my patience has kind of run out a bit on this one. You know, you want us to organise your diary dates and your sausage sizzles because you can't do it yourself. Like, really, dude, seriously. Why can't you do something? Because some of us are getting a bit tired, you know? So do you have any, like, tips? What do you do, Richie, to bring men along with you, apart from, you know, like punching them and kicking them in the head and stuff like that? Like, that seems to work for you, though, right?
Yeah, I think...
The Trojan horse idea that you mentioned last night.
Yeah, I think, like Daniel said, it's about finding the right language and also the right people to use that language. You know, not everyone... We need to find... If you're thinking of how a big brand markets their product, Coca-Cola or Gillette or whoever it is, they find the right model, they find the right tone, they find the right language to use. You wouldn't get me in an ad for Nike women's running. Do you know what I mean? You get, I don't know, an attractive female runner in a stereotypical sense who's a female. Do you know what I mean? We need to find the right champions for the right subset of the audience. So think of if we're trying to bring men into the conversation, we need to build bridges with male allies and help them best communicate in language that men resonate with. And that isn't necessarily the stereotypical language of academic feminism, because most guys, unfortunately, don't understand that language and they feel affronted and got at by it. So it's about tempering our righteous anger and understandable passion to find a pragmatic solution. So it is about, I think, building bridges and using that Trojan horse approach. Like, I think if you can find, and shout out to all the men in the room, and young Ben, who I talked with yesterday, Tom, not Ben, Tom, who's here, because if we can get younger men in particular into the conversation, that's going to be a really positive approach, because they are going to resonate perhaps more than some of us might. So I think also highlighting male self-interest too. Like, if you look at the data, it tells you that stereotypical conceptions of masculinity, and the more we buy into it, are bad for us, the more bad mental health we have, and that we actually live shorter lives. Those sorts of approaches too. I was talking with my girlfriend who came to the presentation last night. She said, "You've really changed in 2 years. You give guys a much fairer go." Because when she first started watching me present, I was all like, here's all the doom and gloom statistics about the crime and violence that men create. But I've come to understand that we need to build bridges, and sometimes by making men, I think not making men, but I think men can feel alienated or like got at because they're unaware of privilege. They're unaware of the privilege that they have just by being a man. When they don't have an academic understanding of that, you have like a kind of like, not me, not all men. But we're not saying all men. We are saying, however, that most sexual violence and family violence is committed by men. That's just a statistical truth. Although most men are not violent. However, it takes all men to change the conversation and all men to change the culture from which that violence emerges. Does that make sense? So I think it's about getting the men who are silent, the non-violent men, which is most of us, to use their voice. And by doing that, we're going to shift the culture from which tangible violence emerges.
Okay. Daniel, do you want to share what you're seeing in schools and how you're trying to reach out to boys in schools to reimagine another way to be male, and what are some of the positive responses that you've seen in the last couple of years?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Melinda. Yeah, it's a real privilege to be able to speak in schools and just push back. And I guess like my hope more than anything is to try and just tear holes in their framework, in their kind of paradigms about sex, relationships, what love is. And so, I'd love them to walk away and never look at porn again and only have healthy relationships. My hope really is to tear some holes in their constructs, because they will encounter it. It's only a matter of time where they see the harms for themselves or those that they love and care for. So that's my hope and what I try to, I guess, stir up when I'm there. And I think the good thing is, there's not been a time where we haven't had people respond afterwards. Everyone can be quite, what teenagers are like, quite scared during the sessions. Hard to get a vibe from 15-year-old guys where they're resonating with this. It's like, as Melinda and I joke, we don't really get kicks from talking to 15-year-old boys about sex and porn. Like, there's far better things I'd like to do with my time. But the incredible thing is just having them come up afterwards and the ones that say, they just resonate with it. They see it, they've seen the harms. And I think what they're seeing is when they see their friends being affected by it. That's, either themselves or their friends, and they've cottoned on, they've woken up and gone, this has to stop, this has to end, we got to do this differently. And so I think, there is some boys in there who are waking up, and I'm so grateful for that. I think girls are obviously waking up faster because this affects them and harms, and it crashes into their world so much quicker, and the consequences are so much worse. So we always get a great response from young women, but encouragingly, there is more young men who just want to push back on it. I think the tough thing for them, and where it is so hard, and this is what I always say with this problem, there are so many things that we could get out into the streets and cause a fuss over, and it would be so much easier because we can just blame like government and corporates. But like this view, issue for men just like cuts straight down our own hearts and minds. And so I think a lot of them know it's wrong, but when they themselves see themselves implicated and participating in systems and practices that actually, you know, even if they know it's wrong, they kind of, I feel, disempowered with it. So it's pretty hard to speak out on because they feel like, well, who am I to actually say anything? Because I just looked at porn last week, or, you know, I kissed a drunk girl last week. And I feel like that's where it's really, really tough to try and bring people along, where they themselves already feel like, well, I've already kind of missed the first mark with this. And I feel like that is something that just trying to, I guess, not just share stories of, good guys who've never done anything wrong, but the transformative stories of guys who were into DV, you know, who have, you know, done horrible things towards women, who have had a shift and a turnaround to let them know that this isn't your lot. It doesn't have to stay like this.
Yes, okay. I'll ask one more question and then we'll throw it open for questions. I think you wanted that to be done, yep. So I'm just wondering, do you think we could be arriving at a cultural tipping point? There are some days when I think it's hopeless, it's over, I'm going to give up.
Don't give up.
No, seriously, there are days. There are days. The stories are so bad, you know, the level of violence, the brutality. I just don't want to have to read another story of violence against women, often porn-fueled violence. And, you know, our colleagues, we all have these days. We debrief multiple times a day. We're talking to each other all the time. But then occasionally there's a little bit of cut through. Occasionally, you know, a guy will say, I've stopped using, or this younger guy that we'd had hoped to have here today, 20 years old, ANU law student, he basically said to me that it was reading the stories of the treatment of women in the industry that made him realise he'd become a patron of this industry. He was contributing to fueling it. So when I meet young men like him that still have this ethical core, that still have a conscience that's alive, and he recognised, oh my God, I'm part of this global industry that traffics women into the production of the images that I'm looking at, you know. And so there are days like that I think, okay, maybe, you know, yesterday I was at John Fisher College here, St. John Fisher College here in Brisbane, and I had a young man say something to me that I haven't heard before. He said, before I heard your presentation, I thought of myself as one of the good guys, year 11. He said, after hearing your presentation, I'm realising maybe I'm not one of the good guys because I have a girlfriend and I've been pressuring her to do things she doesn't want to do, and I didn't really understand why she didn't want to do those things. And then I've seen your presentation and now I respect her and I understand why she wants to make those decisions for her life. And I've had to acknowledge that my view of myself as one of the good guys wasn't actually accurate. So again, that gives me hope as well. Could you share any signs so that we don't all go insane? As to, are you seeing any cultural tipping point indicators with your work in New Zealand, which of course has very high rates of violence against women?
Yeah, but Barack Obama said that better is still good. He said, hey, we had the civil rights movement, doesn't mean there's no racism, but it's still, things are better, right? I think we need to be, we have to be patient. Like, this isn't cool. Do you know what I mean? Like, Cardi B has 35, what did you say? Like
45 million.
45 million followers on Instagram, you know, like, it's, and her rap is like, I fucked a dude and got some money, like it's a good thing. And that is what young people are growing up consuming. Yeah. But at the same time, in the post-Me Too world, where we're starting to talk about feminism and gender equity, and we're looking at sexual harassment in the workplace.
That's right, it's good.
The conversation, I think, is starting to emerge. The fact that Gillette, huge multinational company, took a gamble and made an ad that challenged toxic masculinity so overtly, I think is this actually, despite the pushback, a cause for hope. Because for all the people who vociferously hated it, there were other people, like Daniel said, that supported it. Yep. And they unfortunately just often are more silent. So I think the fact that we get invited into schools, and schools are wanting to have these conversations.
Yeah, that's right.
Governments are starting to consider, how do we protect kids from porn? All those things, while slow and frustrating and painful at times, and we bang our heads against the wall, are actually a cause for hope. You know, it's just, we just have to, you know, what Lao Tzu said, like a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single footstep. Yeah, you know, right, you have to break it down into bite-sized pieces and be in it for the long haul. And we have to build champions. You know, I'm not always, you know, I speak in schools right now and I leverage off the fact that I used to be good at a stereotypically masculine sport, but I'm not always going to be as youth relatable as I am now, and I need to help build secession plans, you know. I want to move into helping young men become trainers or teachers or whatever it may be as I move through life. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
And over that course of time, things I'm hopeful will change. You know, the fact that we're here talking about this is a really positive thing. The fact that I mean, you're clearly younger than I am, you know, and you've got that other gentleman, Daniel, who's going to be here, who's only 20 years old. Like, those are all causes for optimism.
Yeah.
You know, I was just saying last night, I just was on tour with a huge heavy metal band through Australia, a band from England. Spoke at 5 different concerts to over 10,000 different audience members, and I was inundated with regular guys sending me messages on Instagram or coming up to me at the concert saying, thanks, never thought about it like that, or I'm a dad, I've got 2 daughters, really appreciate it. You know, like, when we break it down for dudes in particular, they actually do resonate with it, and they do want to change things, and it's about just having to be patient.
Yeah.
You know, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon.
Yeah, for sure. Daniel, do you want to share some signs of hope? Do you think young men, particularly in the schools that we've been going to, are starting to recognise that, yes, the culture is toxic to girls, but it's harmful to them as well? Are you seeing signs of that?
I think for me, that's where I think it'll shift first is, and Richie touched on it, the self-interest. And, you know, I don't think that's ideal, and I'm going to touch on that a bit later, but I think that's where it will come first. When porn-induced erectile dysfunction numbers just continue to increase, you know, and given how much traditional concepts of masculinity are connected to virility and sexual prowess, like, this will be the first thing. But yeah, I think guys are waking up. I want to touch on also other, like, you know, we've got people like Terry Crews, who's a massive, massive following. He's got millions of people. He's been so publicly outspoken about coming out against porn. And we've just had another very famous basketball player, Lamar Odom, who's come out and said he's quit porn. Like, and for me, you know, again...
Russell Brand?
Yeah, Russell. So there actually is, you know, and it's just what I really appreciate, in particular about like Russell Brand as a point of difference from like very strong African-American, like hyper-masculine dudes, which is great. Like, we need guys like that to come out and say like, you know, I'm done with porn, I'm done with this kind of stuff. But I think you're trying to find champions that don't all look the same. I was telling Melinda, I was so stoked when I found out this guy existed. Because as you can see, we dress a little bit differently. We don't look the same. Like, I kind of know who my audience kind of is and who I can resonate with. I'm not going to be going, like, I actually love Rage Against the Machine. Like, I love metal, but I'm probably not going to be going to too many underground punk kind of spaces. I'm not going to be going to Muay Thai clubs. Like, I'm going to be sitting with inner city sipping kind of, you know, latte sipping, champagne drinking dudes, and just talk to them about how do we smash the patriarchy, you know, over a nice Chianti. That's kind of more my style. But I love that. We need champions of change that look different, and I'm hoping, you know, that as we push back on traditional forms of masculinity, we'll actually bring more and more men into the fold and actually say, this is what it looks like to stand for healthy masculinity. And instead of just like Terry Crews, you know, it'll be lots of different people across the spectrum. And I think that's actually happening, and that's where I'm excited and energized by that.
Great.